Hey leaders, in this episode of Leading Collaborative Response, Lorna and I are joined by Chris Adamson, principal of Innisfail High School in central Alberta and a colleague we've known for many years. Although born in Calgary, Ottawa is where Chris grew up, and after receiving his degree on the East Coast, he began his teaching career with Fort Vermilion School Division in northern Alberta, where he later became vice principal, and completed his MEd in assessment and instructional leadership through the University of Calgary. In his current school, Chris has championed collaborative response and built a solid system of support for students and staff. Let's find out how in our conversation with Chris.
Are you a leader who is navigating the nuances of leading collaborative response in your school or district? Are you unsure of what collaborative response is? Are you looking to understand the critical role leadership plays when establishing and refining a collaborative response approach?
Collaborative response began as a grassroots approach to focus on the needs of students through a framework of collaboration. That approach has grown to a movement that is training leadership and education.
Through the Leading Collaborative Response podcast, Kurtis and I share our own experiences of leading collaborative response and lessons learned as we continue to learn and gain insight through the experiences of working alongside others. We also have the opportunity to engage in conversations with school and divisional leaders implementing the framework in their own organizations.
We know great leaders build great teams because that is what every child deserves. Subscribe to the Leading Collaborative Response podcast and join the thousands of schools seeing success for students through intentional and focused collaborative efforts.
Welcome to another episode of Leading Collaborative Response. As always, I'm Lorna Hewson, co-founder and lead learner of Jigsaw Learning.
And I'm Kurtis Hewson.
Today, we're honored to have Chris Adamson join us once again. For anyone who has been deeply connected to the collaborative response movement over a number of years, Chris should be a recognizable face. He has been on podcasts, presented at multiple collaborative response conferences, symposiums, and retreats, and has helped to support a number of other leaders in envisioning collaborative response for their own schools. Great to see you, Chris.
Yeah, you guys too.
So, Chris, we gave just kind of the brief intro for you here, but start us off with just a little bit of your journey as an educator to the place you're at now at Innisfail High School.
Yeah, so I think I first was introduced to collaborative response when I was a principal in Fort Vermilion School Division. So I think that was back in 2016, 2017.
Yeah, seems about right.
Yeah, I think that's when it was. And I was at Hillcrest, which is a K-9 school. And that was the first time I got the opportunity to implement collaborative response. Really strong staff, great community, and we got a lot done and accomplished a lot in a very short amount of time. And I believe the school is still involved in collaborative response 7 years after I left that building. Mm-hmm. And then I became the principal of the vice principal of Innisfail High School about 7 years ago. And Innisfail High School was when I first met with Kurtis to talk about how to embed collaborative response in this school. Kurtis described it as the school was primed and ready for it. They had collaborative time structured into their schedule. They were very familiar with response to intervention, but they just needed bit more structure and process and layers. And that's something that we've been able to accomplish very successfully over the last 7 years. And this is the third year now as principal of the high school.
And I remember having a few of those Tim Hortons conversations of just kind of scoping out and picking one another's brain of,
what do you
okay,
think?
I know what this looked like in our K-9, but now in this situation, and yeah, that struck me. And we see that over and over again of schools that have really good pieces in place, but we often hear collaborative responses linking. It's the missing piece, and it links it all together, just tightens it up a little bit.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And I remember one of the first barriers here was, how do I make teams at a high school? Where at K-9 it was more natural. So yeah, there's always one thing that you need to kind of tweak, and then lots of schools can be well on their way, I think.
So Chris, when you think about setting up those teams, I'd love to start there because you had a really unique way of setting up your initial teams for when you introduce collaborative team meetings. And I thought it was always really sensational how you didn't try and implement everything. You said, let's just focus in on the one, knowing we'll build the other layers as we go. So how did you come up with those teams? And does it still look like that today at Innisfail High School?
Yeah, so 7 years later, we're still using a very similar approach to building our teams. My initial approach, which I'll explain in a second, isn't as important now as it was 7 years ago, just because staff are very fluent in what to expect in a meeting. There's less going down rabbit holes. We stay within our circle of control. The meetings are just really efficient compared to when we first started 7 years ago. So getting to the high school, having like a couple math teachers, a couple science teachers, one shop teacher, I was trying to figure out how to build teams. And I thought about a bunch of different things. But what I ended up doing was looking at their student overlap. So basically, I made a matrix with all my teachers on it. And if teachers taught a lot of the same students, I placed them on the same team. So that one degree of, I basically was trying to remove a degree of separation between the teachers and the conversation. So that when I brought up Kurtis, the majority of people on my team knew Kurtis because he was sitting in their classrooms.
Right.
So it just made the initial conversations a bit easier. And then also when staff had any questions about, hey, why am I on this team, not that team? The rationale was pretty sound and it just made sense to everybody. So there wasn't a lot of pushback about who's on whose team and why. It just worked out really well. So we still use it as kind of guidance, but there's a bit more flexibility and less reliance on that approach today.
So they weren't necessarily subject area teams then, if they were okay.
Yeah. So I just scheduled like next semester's collaborative team meetings. That's what I was working on this morning. And senior math, shop teacher, junior science, senior social,
excellent,
career high teacher, which is outreach for us. They're all on the same team.
Awesome. So why don't we just jump back for a second, because I have some more questions around this. But when you mentioned junior science, senior math, why don't you give us just a real quick rundown of Innisfail High as far as student population, grades, and approximately how many kids, just to give people context?
Yeah, so we are a grade 9 to 12 school with about 350 full-time students. We have about 5 EAs and about 20 teaching staff, including the vice principal and myself. Within our school, we also have our Innisfail Career High, which is like our outreach school. That's what we call them in Chinook's Edge. So there's about 35 full-time students registered there as well.
Okay, so now you said that you have less reliance on you still use that overlapping like you talked about, but initially it was so that if people were talking about students, the majority of the people around the table could connect or say, okay, yeah, I've got that kid in my room. But I'd imagine that now there's less reliance because I know you've tried to be shifting it into the let's not talk about a kid, but let's use the kid for a key issue. Can you describe what that looks like and how that transition was just natural, I think, in the way that it evolved, not only in your school, but we've seen that evolution in the framework overall.
Well, and people would understand the process so much better now.
Yeah, exactly. And getting to the key issue, like getting staff, it's even hard. Like it's hard for me sometimes to articulate what the key issue is. Yeah. And that's the whole reason why I went with that one less degree of separation initially. But yeah, the staff are very, very skilled now at actually coming to the table. So before they even get to the meeting, they're using their student discussion checklist and they're very articulate about the key issue, and it's not reading or math anymore. It's very specific to what they actually are challenging with. And they know that when they bring that key issue to the table, to the collaborative team meeting, that they've already exhausted their list of supports that they have at their disposal. So that time spent in the meeting isn't as a group trying to actually put our finger on the key issue. A lot of that work is done prior to arriving to the meeting. So it just makes the meeting so much more effective. And then we do still rely on the overlap because like the rationale is just strong and it's almost just the way we do things at Innisfail High now. Yeah. But when I do move teachers around, it's when we have new teachers, I'll shift teams based on experience with collaborative response.
Right.
Because when you have other teachers modeling how to collaborate in those meetings, the teachers new to Innisfail High see that, they experience it, they feel it, and it just gets them up to speed a little bit quicker. So I was thinking you're probably going to ask me that next. So that's kind of how I've shifted things more recently.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just one more around the collaborative team meeting, and then we want to look at some of those other layers. When you're saying teams coming together for collaborative team meetings, how often would those happen? And about how many people would be in the room? And who else is in the room besides just your classroom teachers?
So for any particular team, they happen once a month, once every 4 weeks.
Okay.
We'd have 3 teams throughout the school. So basically 3 out of the 4 week in a cycle, there's a team meeting, but every team only meets every 4 weeks. So there's a gap between meetings.
Okay.
And that gap is a comfortable time for people to implement their action plan and get feedback and then make changes and report back. Our teams are usually about 5 teachers, 4 to 5 teachers. And then in addition to the classroom teachers, we have one administrator that facilitates the meeting. I've debated moving away from that, but it just, from an instructional leadership standpoint as an administrator, I do like to be part of them. So is my vice principal. And then in addition to an administrator, there's our SSL, which is like our other divisions, we'll call it inclusive ed coordinator, that type of person. That person is at every meeting as well.
Okay, awesome. And I said last question, but I've got one more, of course. How does that happen? Is it during the day? Like, how do you get 5 teachers and the others off the floor for that conversation every 4 weeks?
So that was something that Innisfail High already had established before I arrived. We have a flex block. It's moved around in the day and it's changed the number of minutes, but basically it's a flex time that students have ability to pick the teacher they want to go see. And choose the support that they need. So during that on that Thursday during flex time, I'll have those 4 teachers close their flex.
Okay.
And they're off the floor. They're not available to students because they're in a meeting for a collaborative response.
Okay, excellent.
Awesome.
So I've shared the work at Innisfail High in multiple places as a reminder for leaders that when we think of these 4 layers of team, don't try and accomplish all 4 at once. And I've used your specific example of we really honed in on the collaborative team meeting and started there. Then we went to something called our SWOT, and I'll let you describe that. And we really wanted to try and refine that. And then we'll take a look back at our collaborative planning or department teams and help really build that out. So can you describe what those layers look like and if I've got the sequencing right as far as your intentional timing? It really struck me the intentionality of let's go deep in one, get it really operating well, and then we'll tackle the next piece.
Yeah, so I think you said it to me at one point in time, and I will probably say it incorrectly, but when someone asks me, hey, can you explain collaborative response to me? You got 20 minutes. It's not a 20-minute conversation. It's complex. There's so many subtle things and so many bigger structural things that need to be in place. So knowing that after my experience at Hillcrest, coming to Innisfail, I wanted to dose our school with appropriate amounts of collaborative response. And I do know that having an effective collaborative team meeting is kind of where I wanted to start. And then I added layers onto that. Some were already pre-existing and just fine-tuning them. But yeah, collaborative team meetings is where I focused on student discussion checklist, having an agenda, co-creating norms, holding people accountable to those norms and their action plans, like all those things. That's where we spent a good portion of the first couple of years. At Innisfail High, when I arrived, they already had something called a SWAT meeting. And we still have it to this day. It happens every Monday morning. So it's the next layer. It's basically students that need additional support. So like tier 3, 4 supports. That's when those students get discussed. So there's a section at the end of every collaborative team meeting, 5 minutes, where students can be brought forward to the admin team. And then we basically take them and bring them to the SWAT meeting on that next Monday. So
what does SWAT stand for, just for those listening?
Student Wellness Action Team.
Perfect, thank you.
And when it was first created, it was around mental health supports and social emotional wellness. It still is, but there's also a stronger academic focus embedded in there now compared to 7 years ago.
And I thought you had said too that you also in the spot have some externals come in too. Didn't you talk about your school resource officer being part of those conversations potentially?
Yeah, our constable, so our school resource officer, is there every Monday morning. So it's timely too, because things that happen over the course of the weekend that we need to be aware of on a Monday morning, he can help facilitate those conversations. We also include our FSW, our Family School Wellness, and then also some external people from the division, depending on the situation. So it's a different group of people, both administrators, inclusive ed coordinator, our academic advisor, family school wellness, and school resource officer. So it reaches a lot of different places throughout the school and the community.
Well, if you want some reassurance, and this will make you smile a little bit, we recently talked with another school who said, and we've just started SWAT meetings. We heard you talk about that in another presentation, and we thought, ooh,
They like
SWAT,
the
we like that.
acronym.
We'll do that.
Yeah, and I can take credit for that acronym. It was at Innisfail High before I got here. So
awesome. Okay, so then I know then you had shared with us that even prior to engaging in this work, there were departments, not big departments, but people that were sharing similar courses that they were teaching or subjects that were meeting and helping, planning together. You'd have some professional learning days where they'd be working together, but you had said, once we've kind of got the SWOT figured out, then we're going to come back and look at that collaborative planning layer. What does that look like now in the school, Chris?
Yeah, that collaborative planning layer is, I think one of the last times we chatted about it, it's still a work in progress at Innisfail High, because it's ever changing based on staff, school calendars and stuff like that. But basically we have our departments and they will get together. We usually lean on our professional learning days throughout the school year. Sometimes staff will use Flex for it. So they have time and it's scheduled, but it's also on an as needed basis. And sometimes it's directly related to the conversations that happen in the collaborative team meeting, or it's, hey, this is changing from division. Let's all get together, wrap our heads around it, and let's make it work for our school. So it's a bit of both. There's some structure to it on like the big things that we need to accomplish as departments, so that we're all aligned. So the communication to students, to parents is all similar. And then there's other things that happen on the fly during our flex block, and staff know that that's the time that they would lean on for collaborative planning time.
So Chris, let's imagine that Lorna and I are both teaching math, and we just came back from a divisional day where a new assessment screener was being introduced to us, and we just need some time to wrap our heads around. If I'm understanding this correct, could we then come and say, hey, can we have a flex block for us just to have a chance to connect, and that will kind of go off the floor during flex? Have I got that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yep.
Nice. I had talked with another school, 7 to 12. They did something very similar where they also had structured time, but then staff knew you have this space. And they said it had led to some really great informal collaborations where
It's more flexible.
yeah. And two teachers who decide that, hey, we'd like to engage in a cross-subject area project-based learning activity together, and we'd love a couple flexes to kind of flesh out what that would look like.
Yeah, it really opens it up for teachers to have like the autonomy, and once the culture of collaboration is established, and collaborative response is a really good mechanism to do that. It happens naturally.
Yeah, which is an amazing part of, implementing those structures and processes. But through that, you do develop your culture of collaboration.
I would argue, though, that if you had started there, you probably wouldn't have the same traction than because you started with the CPM of being, we're going to be very clear on the processes, the structures. We're going to keep them with fidelity so that when we get to this piece a few years later where it is going to be a little bit more open, people still have habits of working together that'll support that.
And one of the reasons why I started with collaborative team meetings at Innisfail High is before I even brought it to a staff meeting, the idea of it, I talked to every individual staff member, and collected feedback on, hey, what does collab time look like here? What does it look like in the past? Why wasn't it successful? Why doesn't it still exist? And I heard the things that we've probably all heard. We talked about things we didn't need to talk about. Somebody went on too long, waste of time, like things like that. Yeah. So I wanted to make sure we were addressing those concerns through a collaborative team meeting. And it was different for people, right? Because of the norms, because of the structure and the process.
Yeah, absolutely. So Chris, tell us a little bit about, and this is a bigger question than we can address in the time we have, but tell us a little bit about how data and evidence play into your collaborative response at Innisfail.
We'll be right back to continue this episode.
I know for anyone coordinating services and supports for students, it can be a struggle to keep track of and monitor what is happening for students across the school. What if there was an easy way to visually organize students while continuously updating what is in place for their success and ongoing growth? By establishing visual boards with easy access to a comprehensive student profile, organization and tracking concerns become a thing of the past. Start your free trial now to experience the power of WeCollab.
And now back to our conversation.
Yeah, so that was probably, I'd say, the second thing that I brought in after the collaborative team meeting. Like when I think about the three big things, collaborative team meeting, data and evidence, and continuum of supports.
Yeah.
The data and evidence came in right similar time as continuum of supports, but basically, initially I started to build my own spreadsheet. So modeled after something I got off your website. So I'd have like MIPI data, which is a math assessment. I'd have social emotional like indicators, reading scores, attendance, and their grades for every kid for every course they were in. So I started pulling that like big data from Dossier and doing it myself. But after talking with my tech department in Chinook's Edge, they actually built a script that they auto-populate that for me overnight.
Awesome.
So every day I look at it, it's live, which has been really helpful to a lot of schools in our division. So basically I have it color coordinated. It looks similar to a lot of things on your website. There's different indicators. So if their number turns red, it's probably they're below 50%. Their numbers are green if their attendance is over 90%. So at a quick glance, I can sort this Google Sheet based on my poor attenders, my failing students, my high achievers, Math 9, by teacher, and I control that as the facilitator. So if the conversation ever stalls, which it rarely happens because people are so on the ball now, but if it ever stalls, or when it did, I think in year like 4 or 5, during like probably one of our dips, I'd sort it and I'd just kind of highlight the yellow. The kids that were the grades were yellow, which means they were probably around like 55 to 65. So it's like, what can we do for these kids? Because they're on the bubble, they're on the cusp. They just need a small amount of something probably to jump them up. And then once I did that, probably over the course of a year, I believe that staff started to do that on their own. And that's why we don't have to do it anymore in collaborative team meetings. So it was helping staff shine the light on the kids that those meetings are intended for.
Yeah, and that's incredible to move. And once people start really getting into the data, and especially when it's arranged in a way that it's accessible, then people really rely on it because it does give you valuable information about, what comes next and what does this child need next.
But I'm going to jump in. I love what you said there. I heard it from another leader in a session this morning of kids on the cusp. And I would argue if you didn't have a solid data and evidence set for us, it's hard to pull out the kids on the cusp. We go right to the blaring red flag situations, which really that's a conversation in your SWAT because it might involve some additional supports, plans.
Sure. And even now, like the one thing that and staff say, they'll bring up a name and sometimes they're a little bit hesitant because they will literally say, I'm not sure if it's for this meeting or if it's for SWAT, but I just wanted to bring them up. And then as facilitator, I can quickly direct, right? Yeah, it's a SWAT. We'll tag it here, give you their name, and then off we go with the team meeting for the kids that need tier 2 supports.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Chris, I caught you say during one of our dips, I think I know what that means, but can you explain when you say that, what does it mean and yeah, what that has looked like in the school? Because based on what you're going to say, I'm likely going to follow up with it's a natural part of the process. Be ready for it.
Yeah, so I guess I kind of see it's not a straight line going up in progress. There's like natural dips, implementation dips, but there's every once in a while, and they're kind of, you can predict them. So, like I can predict some of them, but one of ours was, I think staff, honestly, their capacity had grown to such a point that when they were coming to meetings, some of them were saying, well, it's all good. Kids are good, I'm good, class is great. But then I had to, as the facilitator, as the school leader, say, well, what about these kids? Why are they 60s, but they're here 99% of the time? Tell me more about this. Then when you ask the question, it's like, oh, like, you know what I mean? So that was a dip for us, that people got, I think, to a point where the capacity jumped up another level. But it was just helping them identify that there's another level and then there's going to be another one. So it's just like it was almost like a sense of comfort and calm that came over us, because we hit a new level, but then it was up to me to show them that there is another one.
Well, and I can imagine in that too of, oh my goodness, now we might actually have an opportunity to start talking about enrichment, which that's at a great level that I know my school long ago, we didn't get into that as a collective conversation. Of course, individual teachers were doing great things, but wasn't a school-wide conversation. We hadn't built the capacity that you're talking about yet.
Yeah, there is an enrichment area on our student discussion checklist. So from time to time, it does get brought up in team meetings.
Perfect. So Chris, you mentioned our 3 pieces, and let's go to continuum of supports. You said it was right about the same time we started some of the spreadsheet things. Tell us a little bit about that work and how it's evolved, because I know from conversations with you, it has not remained static.
Not static.
No, it is a living document. And I think my second year here, I put like a stamp on the doc that says work in progress. And I actually have never removed it. I put it there intentionally to say, like, this isn't done. If someone from another school looked at it, like, don't critique it too hard. It's not done. It's still on there because it is a work in progress, and we're constantly tweaking.
I like that.
Tweaking it. And the best way that we get support, strategies, accommodations, ideas on that document is through our collaborative team meeting. So it's actually through the celebrations process where I will ask what made the difference. And really, when I ask that question, my SSL, my inclusive ed coordinator, and the team knows that what I'm really doing is I'm mining for the support of the strategy. Like, I'm trying to dig it up. Like, what did you do? Articulate it so we can write it down. So my SSL is the note taker. They will actually write it down, and it will eventually make its way into our continuum of support. So every week, 3 of the 4 weeks in our 4-week cycle, we are mining for the new and best strategies that we're finding to be successful in our building. So that's the main way we add to it. But initially, it was the process from your website about like the Post-its around the room. What do we do when what do we do when a student can't yet? And then we did it that way initially, but since that initial process, it's basically through our collaborative team meetings.
Yeah, because it's become a foundation of practice at Innisfail High. Yeah.
So
that's cool.
Here's a question I'd love to ask you then, Chris, before we get into a couple of mainstays that we always ask our guests. You've mentioned 7 years within this, and I know for a fact you do not have the same staff there now that you did 7 years ago. I think you would be a great person to ask, what are some things that you've learned and done when it comes to onboarding staff members who were not here when the first conversations started? How do you go about onboarding now at Innisfail High School when you've said yourself that 20 minutes of trying to explain how everything fits together doesn't quite do it justice? We'll be right back to continue this episode. Are you looking to maximize the collaborative capacity of your school or district? Are you wanting to take your professional learning communities or response to intervention work to the next level? Have you started the work in collaborative response but are looking to reignite or deepen your plans? We would love to have you join us at the 2025 Collaborative Response Retreat happening May 2nd and 3rd in beautiful Lacombe, Alberta.
Over the 2 days, we have an intentionally designed program of breakout sessions and sharing, along with supported team planning time to ensure that you walk away with a plan for introducing or strengthening collaborative response in your organization for the upcoming year. With a concentrated focus on team planning, networking, and individualized support for your school, the Collaborative Response Retreat is an outstanding opportunity to grow your team's understanding and implementation of this powerful support framework. We are also planning some fun time so you can relax and enjoy activities as a team in our historic community of Lacombe in central Alberta.
In addition, participants will gain access to an extensive repository of online resources to deepen their understanding and support ongoing implementation. Plan to join a growing network of educators dedicated to responding to the diverse needs of their learners. We've capped our attendance at 140 participants, so make sure to register early to secure your team spot. We're looking forward to seeing you in Lacombe in May. And now back to our conversation.
Honestly, the start of it starts in my interview process before I even hire people. I put right in the ad, you have to be collaborative in nature. Our division is, and so is our school. So that's what we look for. And then in the interview process, I'm asking some collaborative, even specifically sometimes collaborative response-based questions to get a feel of people, their comfort level in it. And it is something that I look for because it's an integral part of our building. But once we do get a new staff member, one of the main things I do is I'm purposeful about the pairing in mentorship. So in school mentorship, and very purposeful about what team they're put on. So for example, I have three new people to the building this year. None of them are on the same team.
Yeah.
And they're with some people that have been here from the start. So one thing that does is passively they're watching, they're listening, they're experiencing how a collaborative team meeting runs. So that's one way. And it's also a conversation with me. At the start of the year in August, this is the folder, this is the data sheet, and showing them all the stuff, but they really do most of their learning and onboarding through the process itself, right? It's like explaining a board game. You kind of have to play it with your hands shown first before you really get it.
That's a great analogy.
That comes from someone who's got a little one at home.
Yeah.
Little two now.
Don't Rock the Croc is the game right now.
Yeah.
Nice.
Fun. All right. Well, Chris, this has been fantastic, and we could talk for days, I think, on all of the things that have happened at your school over the last 7 years. But would love for you to be able to finish this statement. As a result of collaborative response, we have seen,
I think, an improved culture of collaboration and collective efficacy. I think the whole idea, like there's less siloing and it's more of a wraparound support for all of our kids and less, I don't teach them. That doesn't really happen anymore. There's a philosophy here that I'm a teacher, I can help.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
It's been a big difference.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so then the last question, and this one goes back to your Hillcrest days. In the spirit of if you knew then what you know now, what advice would you have given your Hillcrest self in relation to this work?
I do feel like I was spoiled at Hillcrest because that staff, and very similar to Innisfail High staff, were excellent, and they were ready to dive in. I think it's go slow to go fast. I think it's the dosing piece I talked about, don't do it all at once. Find something that you're confident in. And for me, it was the collaborative team meeting. And I would actually probably make some recommendations for other schools to start there first. Yeah. But yeah, it's pick something you're confident in, that works, and spend the time on that, build the trust and the capacity, and then the other steps are easier.
Yeah, love it. Love it.
All right. So, Chris, always a pleasure to be able to connect. And we know that anyone listening to this podcast can also have a chance to reach out to you. We know you've been great at engaging, mentoring others.
Yeah.
Best way to get a hold of you if someone's wanting to reach out and learn a little more.
Yeah, probably emailing me is best.
Okay.
Sure.
We'll make sure to include the email, and we're also super excited to have you at our retreat in May here in Lacombe.
Definitely.
This, I don't think we really need to give you much prompting on that, because I think, would this be the fourth time, fifth time, maybe sixth?
I think might be the seventh.
Maybe.
Seventh? I just think the first time I presented was vice principal at Innisfail High, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you are one of our mainstays.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's 6 or 7, something like that.
All right. Well,
so exciting.
So great being able to connect with you again, and look forward till the next time. Thanks again, Chris.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Chris. So it was fantastic to visit with Chris again. And we mentioned that he's been along this journey alongside of us for a long time. But every time that you talk to him, there are just so many things that pop out in terms of his very thoughtful consideration of how he implements in his school.
So this is something I've always appreciated about Chris, and there's a lot of things I appreciate about Chris, but he's almost like a master chess player in the way he goes about the work of, he's thinking about what they're doing now, but there's always 5 plays ahead.
Yeah.
That thinking, and him and I have had some conversations back and forth of, okay, we're at this right now. Here's what I'm seeing, but there's a couple steps ahead that I'm thinking towards. Can we just chat through it? Because I know we're moving towards that on the horizon, and really it goes to his idea. And I've never heard this before. I've heard the concept lots, but never the exact word of dosing.
Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah, I like that too.
Of dosing just appropriate amounts, because we know that if you increase the dose to too much, that leads to
that's
catastrophic things happening.
Place either.
Yeah,
there are. So one of the things that I just jotted down, and I think I really appreciate him talking about, is that he and his assistant principal facilitate every meeting.
Yeah.
And they find great value in being able to be there and hear what's happening for both staff and students. And that gives him and his vice principal an incredible knowledge about the teams. And that just makes a big difference to students too.
To me, this is one of the interesting things about the collaborative response work, and why it could never be a checklist or a playbook for collaborative response, because in some buildings, we see leaders that are very intentional at training others to lead that facilitation, because in their mind, they're doing it to build up skill sets and leadership in others, which there's huge value.
Well, and when you think about much bigger schools than Chris's school, they're, in some instances, they don't have any other option but to train other people.
But then
to facilitate.
In Chris's space, to be able to say, but actually we like doing that because it's a big part of our instructional leadership and modeling. So when somebody says, well, should the administrator be facilitating or other people? We always give the response of, well, it depends. Yeah, it really depends with what you're trying to achieve, and what you're trying to achieve today, that might change. In the future too. There's not black and white in this work. I really liked, and we've known this for a long time, of Chris's attention to the fidelity of the structures, but then, and it goes again with that chess player mentality of being really purposeful. He used that word a few different times around, I have new team members. I'm very purposeful in putting each one in different teams. No new people are on the same team, because I'm trying to get them onboarded into the process. The idea that I'm going to create teams with one less degree of separation than they would normally have by having student overlap
Mhm.
that happens. And when he first showed it to me, the spreadsheet he had to determine the team membership was fairly complex to
Yeah.
try and figure out who's teaching who and when and what, but then just becomes part of that system, but all with a high degree of intentionality.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about even before he creates those teams, he's putting a consideration into the interview process
Yeah.
of how collaborative are you, and really digging into that idea of, is this a person that is going to work well on our teams? And so that consideration comes long before setting up those teams even.
Absolutely. So, we'll be connecting some resources as well from Innisfail High School to be able to get a bit of a deeper understanding, as well as Chris's contact information there. We're also super excited to have Chris once again as one of the schools that are sharing their work at our collaborative response retreat happening in May. If you go to jigsawlearning.ca/events/retreat, you'll find all the information there. And also, Chris is having the opportunity to present at the ULead conference in Banff, Alberta in April. Check out ulead.ca to be able to connect with Chris and his assistant principal there. As always, please share, like, subscribe to the podcast and help to grow the understanding of the great work that all of these different schools are doing in relation to responding to the needs of students and ensuring that every student is benefiting from highly intentional structures of teams. So, wishing you all the best.
See you soon.